In Herzogenaurach, it was said, half in fun, people first looked at your feet to see whether you were wearing Adidas or Puma.
You really had to experience firsthand what it was like in a town with 2 factories and 2 soccer clubs. People just avoided one another.
2 new firms in Herzogenaurach were looking for powerful allies, like national soccer team coach Sepp Herberger. When he visited Puma boss Rudolph Dassler at the new factory, at first Puma had the better hand, but not enough money.
I know he wanted money, but he'd badly miscalculated, because Rudolph Dassler was deaf to that sort of thing.
The next day, he gathered us all together and said, I think I've made a mistake. We gave Herberger short shrift. I'm not sure that was the right thing to do. Nonetheless, we will continue to make progress. Then, of course, Sepp Herberger went to Adidas. As far back as I can remember, there was never a bad word between them. They had a bond, like 2 brothers.
The 1954 World Cup saw the conflict between Adidas and Puma escalate. The German team wore Adidas boots. Their designer, Adi Dassler, enjoyed the trust of Sepp Herberger and was always by his side as kitman. Adi Dassler, it was soon claimed, had developed boots with screw-in studs especially for the tournament. On the wet turf of Bern, they were a decided advantage. Even the referee put his faith in Adidas. It was the birth of a soccer nation and of Adidas as a world brand.
Schäfer nach innen geflankt, Kopfball, abgewehrt, aus dem Hintergrund müsste Rahn schießen. Rahn schießt, Tor! 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 Aus! 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 Das Spiel ist aus! Man hat das richtig gut gemacht.
You have to say they handled things really well at Adidas. They presented this story, this fairy tale so well that it really opened the door for Adidas as an international brand.
Our colleagues on the other side probably took it as a real blow because it was a huge triumph that was all over the newspapers. I'm certain that the products they manufactured were also good, although perhaps a tad inferior to ours.
Such comments made staff at Puma furious because Puma had already marketed screw-in studs before the 1954 World Cup.
It's true. We'd supplied all the West German leagues with them as early as the 52-53 season. The entire Hanover team, champions in 1954, wore boots with Puma screw-in studs.
At least a dozen people worldwide claim with complete justification that they have a patent on screw-in studs. But what was particularly interesting in this case is that it was the first system that really worked.
So in all likelihood, neither Puma nor Adidas really invented the screw-in stud. Still, the triumph belonged to Adidas. In the years that followed, the rivalry became increasingly unscrupulous. Adi Dassler suspected industrial espionage.
The development department was sacrosanct to him. No outsider was ever allowed in. On one occasion, an adhesives representative, whom we always needed, showed up. And he was actually in the development department when the boss came in. If I didn't know you so well, the boss said, I'd shoot you on the spot.
Puma boss Rudolph was also worried about his inventions, but he was also curious.
I once went into his office and saw an Adidas boot on his desk. It had been cut in half. He showed it to me and said, Georg, take a look at this. And I said, well, once again, we found out a lot. That's actually good for our firm, boss. And he replied, yes, but you know, although I love the treachery, I hate the traitor.
To emulate the brother he despised, Rudolph wanted a world champion at almost any price, so he too started developing his contacts with sports stars, but he wasn't prepared to dig deep into his pocket.
In spite of this very intense rivalry, the lieutenants sometimes crossed the river. And most of the time, the point of this was to sort of stem the rise in the demands of football players. So, you know, they would make little deals, particularly about German football players and clubs. And on one particular occasion, for one man who was, you know, completely unique, they came to a sort of peace agreement called the Pelé Pact.
Brazilian star Pelé was the world's finest soccer player, and when it came to advertising, no one was in greater demand.
Pelé was a player who had a price normally no one could afford, because he was gifted with such unparalleled skill. If the two firms had started to fight over Pelé financially, each would have had to fork out an enormous amount of money. So they came to a tacit agreement, it seems, that neither would approach him.
Rudolph and Friedel Dassler sent son Armin to the 1970 World Cup in Mexico to sign up stars apart from Pelé, but the brilliant Brazilian proved too tempting. So after the tournament, Armin flew to Brazil with around $100,000 in cash.
It's said that he kept the money in a safe, but in reality he had it stashed in flower pots.
At last, Puma too had a legend on the payroll, but to achieve this, Armin Dassler had broken the Pelé Pact between Adidas and Puma.
At some time or other it came out that he'd received money. That gave rise to some pretty nasty scenes involving my father and Horst Dassler.
The conflict between two brothers widened into a war between their sons. By now, Horst Dassler was in management at Adidas, and he tackled Puma's Armin Dassler about the Pelé affair.
I'm sure he had a very bad time. I mean, what can he do? The main consequence of this is that from there on in, all deals were off.
In the early 70s, German soccer players were among the best in the world, and the country's international stars were wooed by Adidas and Puma. The German FA had committed itself to Adidas, but Puma refused to give up and sent out agents to try and get players to change their affiliation. The tug of war really came to the fore at the 1974 World Cup. The West German side was comprised mainly of players from Bayern Munich and Borussia Mönchengladbach. When playing for their clubs, some wore Adidas boots, others Puma. Senior director Adi Dassler also wanted Puma wearers like Berti Vogts to switch to Adidas.
The boss prepared me. Have him try them on, he said. Otherwise he'll claim afterwards that they didn't fit. So I did. I told folks my boss wanted him to try them on. So please do me the favour, I said. I can't lie to my boss and tell him you tried on the boots when you didn't. Okay, he said. Hand them over. He took the boot, lifted up the tongue, looked inside and said, "There's nothing in here." I was really naive, of course. I didn't twig what he meant, what he expected to find in the boot. But when I told my boss, he laughed.
Adidas versus Puma. The war between the two brothers sent prices soaring. The players knew that the German FA had long been using them as advertising media. Now they wanted a share of the spoils. In the training camp at Malente, they revolted.
It was the first time that a group of players had insisted on their personal rights and demanded money for wearing a certain brand of boot.
The whole squad had gathered in the dining room because there was a huge discrepancy between the players' views as to what they should get and those of the West German FA. Discussions went on through the night, and at one point the entire national team almost decided to go home the very next day.
In Malente, players like Hoeneß, Beckenbauer and Bonhoff haggled with the German FA all night long.
Naturally, we knew about other sums that were being paid. So we knew which direction to take and how far we could push things. And we were pretty successful.
Around 6 a.m. reason prevailed. Otherwise, Germany could have gone to the World Cup without its internationals. It was that close.
At the end of the long night, the players and the German FA reached agreement. The team would not boycott the World Cup. Disaster had been averted. At the last minute.
In the end, cash flowed.
From the German FA?
No, back then from Adidas via the German FA.
West Germany became world champions, once again in Adidas footwear. Adidas maintained its ties with the German FA. By now, Adi and Rudolph hadn't spoken a word to each other for many years. On one occasion they met by chance at a trade fair for sports goods. But this time too, there was just stony silence. In the autumn of 1974, only a few months after the World Cup, Puma boss Rudolph Dassler fell seriously ill. Now it wasn't his brother he was battling against, but death, and he wanted to square things with Adi.
He wanted to see his brother one last time before he died. So Armin went to Adolf and asked whether he could possibly grant his father's wish.
A priest was asked to mediate.
I went back and forth from one brother to the other, from Rudolph Dassler, who was ill, to Adi Dassler, who was still active, discussing the matter with them. And I must say that there was a desire for reconciliation not only from Rudolph, but also from Adi Dassler.
Adolf
Dassler told me that he no longer held a grudge against his brother. It's over, he said. But he never went to see him.
At Rudolph's funeral, Herzogenaurach cemetery was packed. Would the hatchet at last be buried along with Rudolph? Everyone wondered whether Adi would turn up, but he didn't. The leopard couldn't change its spots.
Most of the guests, of course, were curious as to whether Adolf would appear. But nobody said anything.
There's an old saying that the longer a hedgehog puts off giving birth, the pricklier it will be. And the longer the two brothers drifted apart, the harder it was for them to come together again.
4 years after Rudolph, Adi died. He was buried at the same cemetery, but at the other end, far away from his brother. Theirs was an enmity that continued beyond death. Käthe, his mother, Adidas was now run by Horst Dassler, Adi's son, a new type of entrepreneur.
Horst was a global player who built up a network of companies in order to secure the rights to the European Championships and the Olympic Games. He had one of the sharpest minds in the business.
It's always said that my father would love to have been like Horst Dassler. But I can't imagine that. I don't know too much about Horst Dassler, but I am aware of all the dirty deals associated with him. By comparison, the Palais affair was small beer. It wasn't in my father's nature to behave like that.
Things got tougher in the business. One day, Puma boss Armin and his son Jörg were at home together.
I was sitting with my father in the living room in our house in Herzogenaurach. He'd just been on the phone, and I was trying to tune in to a particular radio station when I suddenly heard my father's voice on the radio. Something's crooked, I thought. Someone had bugged his phone. I'll leave it to your imagination to decide exactly who planted the bug, but there aren't exactly a lot of alternatives. It certainly wasn't me listening in on my father.
Whoever had bugged the Puma boss could have learned of his expansion plans. Puma signed a contract with tennis star Boris Becker. The battle with Adidas took its toll. The millions it paid to Boris Becker almost broke Puma. Shortly afterwards, Adidas followed suit by signing up Steffi Graf. The duel was becoming more and more relentless. When Lothar Matthäus moved to Adidas club Bayern Munich, things became complicated. Since his father was a caretaker at Puma, Lothar was under contract with Puma.
My whole family worked for Puma, so I felt a certain commitment to the firm, which Uli Hoeneß understood. But he wanted the transfer to go through at all costs. So he had to reach an agreement with Adidas that would permit Lothar Matthäus to wear Puma boots as a Bayern player.
The main problem was that Lothar's father worked for Puma, and Lothar was worried that his father would get the sack if he signed for Bayern Munich and had to play in Adidas boots. But agreement was reached, I believe, in that should his father really lose his job, he'd be taken on by Adidas.
Herzogenaurach is slowly growing together again. The two rival company headquarters still stand on opposite banks of the Aurach, but in the face of competition from Nike, production has long taken place in the Far East. And today, stockholders call the tune. The conflict between two brothers is now a battle between two international concerns. At the 2006 World Cup, thousands of fans without tickets watched the emotionally charged final on giant screens. Hardly any of them realised that they were also watching a final contested by Adidas and Puma. After so many years, the old opponents were facing one another in a World Cup final for the first time, and both wanted to win.
There's no doubt, of course, that it was a historic event for Puma. Never in the firm's history had a team wearing Puma boots reached the World Cup final.
It was pure chance that a Puma team reached the final. In the long run, there's no way Puma can hold a candle to Adidas in the soccer arena.
A moment with 80 years of prehistory.
The big question was simply Adidas or Puma. Putting everything else aside, now it was simply Adidas playing against Puma.
Both firms declared themselves World Cup winners. Puma, Italy's sponsor, took the prestige of victory, while France's sponsor Adidas won market share. The battle continues.